Gracious Nyamupachitu is somebody that, she brings a really fantastic energy to every conversation she has, and there was nowhere near enough time to have this conversation with Gracious. She has moved countries, embraced new cultures, and pivoted between DIB careers and strategy and operations in a way I've never seen anybody do before. All of the answers to all of the questions make such complete sense when you hear her speak, and I'm sure you'll feel the same when you hear it too. So Gracious, I found you on LinkedIn, and if I had have been searching for really cool people that are like super inspiring and do things you think can't be done, then it would have been a perfectly accurate result. I think I would have haven't found you. But I think you actually popped up in my newsfeed through probably a connection type thing. And I was following you then from that point on. And it's the energy for me and the passion for all of the things that you do. So I thought I'll take a chance and I'll reach out and see if we can have a conversation. And I am so happy to be here doing this right now. And I'm hopeful that I know I'm going to learn some bits and pieces about how to tackle life and how to tackle careers. And hopefully those who are listening will too. So you're very, very welcome.
Thanks, Jenny. And thanks for such a kind intro as well. So I appreciate it.
And I don't even no lies here. Can't do that. Let's start with all of the stuff that you've been doing. Actually, no, let's not start with the stuff you've been doing around the DIB bit. Let's start with your background. Tell me a little bit about your history and what led to the role that you're in now.
Yeah, so obviously my name is Gracious. I was actually born and raised in Zimbabwe. And then I moved around a little bit between 2013 and 2018, which is when I came to Ireland. Landed in a corporate banking career and almost immediately started doing corporate banking on one side, driving diversity and inclusion initiatives on the other side, as you mentioned. And I'm glad it actually shows through on my LinkedIn. It's just a passion. It comes from my identity, right? I am a Black woman and I am an immigrant. So it's one of those things that is personal to me, but also just looking around and seeing that there's just so much room for more representation and even more awareness and education around the challenges of representation. So I did corporate banking and driving diversity and initiatives, and that was for about 4 years with Citibank. And then I moved over to Pinterest. So I transitioned into the tech industry to do a role there that was the first role on their marketing strategy and operations team. And this was about, building up something that didn't exist in the company. So on one hand, it was super high stakes, right? Because impact, is very noticeable, but also thank goodness that I could actually just get in there and come up with some great ideas. And I'm ever grateful to the lady who hired me there because she really did give me free reign to look at things and try to function and processes and, initiatives that would help the marketing team work better across the globe. But I didn't leave DEI behind. So at Pinterest, I've actually had amazing opportunities to let that side shine a lot more. So through leading the Women at Employee Resource Group, being the chairperson for our first ever Global Women's Conference, a couple of initiatives here and there that have sort of led me to expanding outside of Pinterest and starting to do some DEI work just in the tech industry more broadly with other organizations and, doing talks, doing podcasts like these. And that's where I am today.
I love it. I love it feels like a real natural growth, but we both know that there's a lot of effort in that. You don't just roll out the bed and suddenly find yourself doing all of those things. You have to have that passion, I think, to see it through and do it well. And then you've led a lot of groundbreaking initiatives on the Pinterest side. Like you say, you had free reign in a lot of cases prior. And what were the key lessons that you learned about making that strategy really effective and sustainable that anyone else could learn from?
Yeah. So I think, when I hear you say effective and sustainable, I think the first thing is about it being effective. And I learned that it was so important not just to focus on the community. So the community is the top priority. So if I'm doing women's initiatives, women are the top priority. Black people initiatives, Black people are the top priority. But there's so many stakeholders involved in making an initiative effective. And it was so important to make sure that once we've ticked the box of, are we representing, advocating for, and supporting the community that we're doing initiative for, we go to the next layer of like, are we including senior leadership? Because that top-down visibility, and for things to actually become part of the very fabric of a company, you need leaders to be brought in. So getting leadership involved. Things like people managers, right? From first level managers all the way up to senior management. Are people being empowered and encouraged to get involved in diversity initiatives, even if they're not on the diversity and inclusion teams, right? And it goes broader, the general employee population, allies. Making sure that there's connectivity with more people outside of the community makes initiatives more effective and makes them come as second nature to everyone else. I think when it comes to that sustainability piece, it's about the initiative having an impact beyond the metrics that only people like you and I who are within diversity understand. So it's things like, did someone who was part of initiative actually qualitatively or anecdotally say that that is the reason they prefer to stay at this company? So did that move a retention metric, qualitatively? Gathering some of that data and using that to be like, well, we're doing something that keeps people here, or we're doing something that makes other people want to come here, is how you then get sponsored to do more and supported to do more. So I think that's what really then drives the sustainability.
You make it sound so easy because, well, I guess frankly it is if you get people on board. Like you say, I was speaking to a mentee of mine this morning who works in GRC, and she was talking about like building out for Dora, I think it was, and all of the templates and the processes and the documentation for that. And then we were debating over, well, you can build the most beautiful structures and put them in place, and they can be absolutely immaculate down to the letter of the law. But if the people don't understand why they're doing it and why they should be involved in it, then it's not going to work. You have to get people involved in the process. So whether it's compliance and regulation, or whether it's in diversity issues, and the diversity ones, they hit on a different level. Like, I think there's very, very few people who haven't at some point felt excluded from something. So even if they are the stereotype that we see in a lot of jobs and meetings and companies, even that stereotype has something somewhere that they can lean into, where they'll go, I remember I wasn't picked for the soccer team and I know what it was felt, somewhere they can do it, they can understand it. And I think drawing upon that humanity is key. Like, say, everyone wants to feel included, even those who are driving it.
Yes,
shouldn't be excluded from it. So like, it feels so logical, yet it falls over so many times because there isn't the same drive and passion at every level that there needs to be. And then so you do a lot of work with the women at groups you mentioned there in the beginning. How do you make sure that intersectionality is an integrated part of the company culture? In that's not an easy one to do either.
It's not. And I love how you've already touched on, everyone can relate. This impacts everyone. And I think when it comes to intersectionality, that's been my approach anyway. So I'm strategy and operations lead on the marketing communication. So the business side, I'm not in the company, or I've never been in the company being, someone who was hired to do DEIB. So my approach is a little bit more grassroots than it might be for someone who's, professional.
I love that though. I love that, because different is good. Don't we all know that?
Exactly. No, and I absolutely love that. And it also means like you can push the boundaries a little bit with what you get to do. But thinking about it from a grassroots way, I think there's so much power in driving initiatives that people feel are relevant for them. Too often, so when I think of like the Woman App community and the program that I ran last year, which was called the Woman And. So it was like, I am a woman and all of these people would say, I'm a woman in Black, or a mother and neurodivergent and, lesbian, whatever it is that they wanted to share. And it really just broadened what the face of the woman community could be. So often when we're doing a community the face of what a community looks the same. So I'll give you an example, right? Typically, when you're talking about the disabled community, you typically see visible disabilities, right? That's who is then put on the poster to talk about the community. Similarly with women, I found that in women's communities, it's typically a white woman, right? So I think one of the things that really is important to bring to light is that there is so much diversity within the diversity. And once you start to dig in and do that, everyone starts to realize, hey, I belong here too, because this is the way that I sort of connect to this community. And so I think that approach is more digestible for everyone, and it raises awareness to the concept of intersectionality without getting into the complexity of this really deep-rooted systemic, concept around diversity and inclusion and the challenges. It allows everyone to engage, which you want to do first. And then once people get an understanding, you can then move into the deepest, hand it over to IND to really drive like the learning and development initiatives and use the word intersectionality a little bit more so that people like get introduced to the concept in a more digestible way.
It's like what you said in the beginning about community being at the forefront of it all. And I think in order to do that, you need to be able to communicate freely to and from all of those communities. So if people feel like it's siloed and they, I'm clearly I'm not Black. I'm an ally and supporter of such, but I kind of, can I be in there? Can I be a part of that group? And it breeds the wrong thing because because people are when I say people, a lot of companies are so focused on the tick box exercise of having ERGs or having to do these things for whatever reasons. They're not, like I said, the right intent is not behind it. And if they had community at the forefront all the ways, then you can't have wrong intent behind it if you're always focusing. I always say, always focus on the human. There's a bit I always ramble about when we talk about things like cybersecurity, because if they don't understand it, then we're at a lost cause. Like, no, it doesn't matter how many great computers you have. Somebody sticks a Post-it under their keyboard with their password. The fancy technology isn't going to do anything for you. In the same kind of vein there, like if everybody isn't comfortable asking about other groups and what they can do to help or what they can learn from it, then it's creating almost miniature wrong environments as opposed to one bigger one. Like, yeah.
No, absolutely. And like, just when you say that little miniature environments, that's actually power of any intersectionality based diversity and inclusion initiatives, right? Because the amount of times we come together as employee resource groups to do something that we couldn't have, maybe because as individuals, we wouldn't even have the resources or we wouldn't have the connections to do these things. You drive more impact by coming together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The more I learn, like, I mean, if I'm really honest, I'd say maybe 10 years ago, I would have had no clue about any of the groups. Even I would have struggled to answer the question as to why there needed to be more women in roles other than, well, because there should. So, to be able to argue back at somebody why it's important. And I've learned so much, but all of that is not off of a sheet of paper. It's from having conversations with people in all of the different groups and understanding why they want to do it. And that's the best place to learn is from other human beings. And like, even remember we had an event in work once where we had like do you call it like a potluck, I think, in the States, where everybody brings in something that they've made. And we specifically did it around everyone brought in something that they ate as a child, that it was something like a comfort food. And I remember, like, there's always the risk, because I was raised in the 80s and the 90s with two brothers who would eat nothing but bread, butter and Rice Krispies or something, really boring. So I fully expected people to go, I'm not eating that. But the curiosity when people got in there was fantastic. And then we were learning not only about why they were eating that, whether it was just cultural or whether it was to do with financial reasons they were eating it, or it was a historical recipe and where it came from, because there was something like 28 different nationalities that were in that office at the time. And I learned so much in that space of a couple of hours just listening in on the conversations, and it felt really natural to ask, which is the power of bringing people together. Because when you're if you're in the office of a regular day, it's a little weirder to walk up to somebody and go, hey, how do you cook this recipe? Because clearly you're Indian and I want to know how to cook this Indian food. It's right. I mean, it might be coming from a good place and it might not be the best way to approach it. I love those events, and I always learn something. Even if I sit down and say nothing, I will always learn something from them. And yeah, I think the biggest challenge we've always had is trying to get the middle-aged white men to be involved in the groups.
Right.
And I always think it was never because they didn't want to. It's because they've gotten to the point now where they feel like they're encroaching on somebody's space by doing it, even if they're an ally. And what are your thoughts on that, actually? How do you get around that? Because no doubt you have some that work in the company too. Like,
so I think the first thing that we need to tell all allies is you don't just wake up and decide you do wake up and decide you're an ally. But to be a good ally takes work. I have to be an ally too. There are groups that I don't belong to. I'll give you an example. I was writing an article about the Woman and program, and I was talking about the initiative that we did with our internal disability awareness community. And I wrote a sentence, and in my head, I was like, I think this is what I read about how to talk about this community on Google. But instead, I humbled myself and I said, it doesn't matter what Google says. It doesn't matter what I think I know being in this space. I reached out to someone in the community and I said, I really hope you don't mind me asking, please read this paragraph and tell me if that's how best to represent your community. So even I, who is always in these spaces, humble myself consistently to learn from the communities that I'm not a part of. And I think sometimes it's reminding people that you don't have to know it up front. Asking is okay. In fact, encouraged. Please ask.
yeah.
Because
Oh my God.
people
I'm so passionate about that because I've learned, I think don't be afraid to be the person in the room that asks what would appear to be the stupid question or the obvious question. I think if there's nothing that I've learned in all of my years, so I would rather put my hand up and go, okay, I want to make sure that I get this right. I want to make sure that I pronounce your name right, or I want to make sure that I refer to you right. If I'm talking about you, she's from, do you want to be referred to as from Ireland? Do you want to be referred to as being from Zimbabwe? Do you want to be not referred to as that way at all? I want to get it right. And I don't know how to ask you without feeling like I'm even asking the question wrong. So please help me out here. A, how should I have asked you that so that if I need to ask anybody again, I can do it right the next time? And B, what should I do in this situation? And I spoke, I think with Cyber Ireland, I was speaking recently and I was saying, talking about people that are neurodivergent. I said, ask them about their neurodivergency. It's a big long word. But I said, because we love to talk about it. We absolutely love to talk about it. Right. But we don't often like to tell you about it straight off the bat. But if you ask questions, we will. And I came out at lunchtime and there was a guy sitting at a table that I sat in at. And he said to me, so is it okay to ask you a question? And here's my intention. He did exactly what I had said when I was presenting. I didn't realize until I was answering his questions that he had done it. And then he starts laughing. And I was like, see how easy it is. I was just going, yappity, yappity, yap. And most people are aware, I think, I'm not speaking for most people, but as a woman in tech and as a neurodivergent, I'm well aware that people, A, think that I'm somehow an expert on these things simply because I'm a part of that group. And B, people are afraid to get it wrong when they ask me something. So I'll always say, I have asked stupid questions. I've asked about, do I refer to Black people as people of color or Black people, or is there other? And I know it's changed over the years. And I got into a to and fro with a lady in PR over what was the right way to do it now. And then I'm even based on my childhood years. I didn't see my very first Black person till I was about 9 years old, and I thought it was the most stunning thing I'd ever seen in my life. I was absolutely mesmerized. Never seen it. My mother was not impressed with me because I kept staring. But when we said it, it was almost like when people say cancer. Like if somebody said there was a lady that had a child out of wedlock and the child's father was Black. He wasn't around anymore. So the child was light skinned, but definitely not white, if you know what I mean. But I remember she said oh, personalized. And there's this like there's something terrible about it. So I was raised with that. So when somebody told me that you say Black people, even now there's a little part in the back of my brain that goes, no, you're supposed to say people. So it takes all of these years of conditioning and me saying really stupid things like that because I know somebody else out there, definitely somebody my age and definitely somebody my age in Irish out there is going to be going, oh my God, it's not just me then. Because, you know, they didn't exist in the 80s, or if they did, they were only in cities. So our country's changed a lot for the better by far. And I don't know if we're keeping up with it. But yeah, the asking the questions is just, please do ask anything. Like,
I love how you talked about, like, you were having a conversation with someone in PR about, is it people of color, is it Black people? And you were going back and forth and seeing how many times it's changed. I think, like, the two things I have to say to that are, first of all, the unlearning, right?
sure.
Sometimes you learn something and you know that it's the right thing, and maybe it was for some time, but you have to unlearn it and learn the next thing. And I think that happens in anything to do with diversity and inclusion all the time. And then I think the second thing is also having the one-on-one conversations with people. I think you mentioned that in the place where you were speaking, and someone then came up to you afterwards. They didn't, I mean, yeah, sure. They could have asked, like, in the conference room, in the entire crowd that you were presenting to, but there's no power in going to ask someone from the community directly. That's a more intentional conversation. It's a more intentional allyship. And you give them the opportunity to say, hey, I prefer to be called a Black person.
Yeah.
But in this certain space, it is more appropriate to say people of color. And in that certain place, it is more appropriate to say Black people, you know, and it almost takes the weight off of our shoulders to have to represent everyone neurodivergent and everyone Black, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes allyship is giving the space to allow someone to be the individual instead of for them to represent an entire group.
Yes, absolutely. Because often you're representing it and you weren't asked to, you just are because you look different.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of pressure for somebody who often just wants to come in and do the job and get on with their day. Like, but yeah, I love that, like you say, and I learn those lessons so much faster when I have the one-on-ones, because I remember them better than giving me a sheet list of rights and wrongs. I attach them to individuals than an actual fact or story. And I think we're back again to community and humanizing things. Like, the more we do, which is just, sorry, really interesting. I wandered off a little bit there, but and I may do again. So the DIB work, it often involves facing these, like, deep-seated challenges. Of course, you're going to come across them all the time. Has there been hurdles that you faced that were unexpected, and what have you had to do to overcome those?
Yeah. So I think for me, so I grew up in Zimbabwe, which is a very patriarchal society. Then I moved to the Middle East, which is also known as being very different in terms of how women and how people who are not women show up in society. And then moved to Europe, which is also very different, and I think a lot better at the surface. But then you start to dig in a little, and you're like, we still have issues. So if there's one thing that's always been true for me, it's navigating the world as a woman. But when I was in Zimbabwe and I was Black as a woman, it didn't really matter. It's only when I left Zimbabwe that I realized, oh, hang on, being Black is different out here. And similarly with, like, my being a Zimbabwean citizen and then leaving the country and being in a country that is not your own. That's a really long-winded way of saying I represent so many identities, I guess,
Yeah.
that have diversity groups that need more representation and need more inclusion initiatives. Yet I find myself always leading the ones about. And I think the deep-rooted challenge that I consistently face is people asking me or expecting me to be a leader or to be representing these other things that I so clearly represent.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, the challenge is, like, answering those people. And then on the other hand is going home and almost feeling guilty for myself to say, I wish I had an extra 24 hours in every day so I could lead all the things that I care about. And these are just the ones about identity, right? Like, we haven't even gotten into the things that I care about that are not about my identity. And
Yeah.
so I think the biggest challenge has been, like, choosing where it is that I lead versus where it is that maybe I'm sitting in the background being part of the group that's being advocated for. But always having some sort of conflict with that and feeling like I can do more and I should do more, and, like, people are justified in expecting me to be doing more. But for anyone who's listening and who does anything to do with diversity and inclusion work, I think, like, taking care of ourselves and remembering that we are as much part of the community as we are leaders of the community is so important. And not feeling like you have to carry the whole world and represent every identity and make sure everyone is being driven at the same time. Like different cycles, different times to do things. And yeah, I'm saying that for them, but I'm saying that for myself.
Yeah, I'm going, are you listening though? But it's so true. Like you say, you end up in these roles, and I think sometimes people expect us to, if they meet us in a pub somewhere, that we're starting arguments all the time about how women are better than men. I'm like, oh, that's not what we're saying. And if that's what you think we're saying, like maybe go away and read some stuff.
Yeah.
It's just it's always not always. Sorry, initially for me anyway, it was seen as an aggressive stance to take any kind of a leadership role in this kind of stuff. And I think, like I mentioned, I knew nothing about it 10 years ago, but the more I've learned and the better I am able to articulate myself, and you articulate yourself beautifully. So it's no wonder that you're out at the forefront of it. I think you get better at that over time and navigating the people where they've no interest in listening to you. They just want to start a fight versus the people who genuinely want to learn and they make it your fight all the time. And that one was difficult for me in the beginning because, like I say, I wasn't very good at articulating it. And I found myself in these conversations where one in my case, one man would start the conversation, and next thing there'd be 4 or 5 men there going, yeah, he's right. And I'm going, you're losing it before you've even opened your mouth. But these days, I find I don't come up against them as much. Maybe I'm giving off an aura where they just don't see me anymore. But or I'm better able to articulate it, and that in itself is exhausting. Even now that I'm better able to do it than I would have been able to do it then. And I think there's a fear as well. I'm not going to assume that you feel it, but when you're speaking, do you worry? I don't as much anymore. I used to, but I used to worry that that I was representing everyone. That there was no shades of grey. That's not the right. That was a really bad choice of words to use. No different levels or tiers or no differentiators really between people. That when I was speaking, I was representing all women in tech, or and I was terrified of saying the wrong thing because some people do want to be at home, some people do want to work, some people do want to be parents, some people don't, and all of these things. I don't worry about it anymore. I always remember to talk about my experience. But do you get many people that come at you over things like that? I mean, it's obviously you begin this on a voluntary basis, but it becomes who you are in many ways.
It does. It becomes your brand everywhere you go. Oh, you're the person who leads this and leads that. And could you do this and could you do that? So it does. And people, I would say people come at me as much. And maybe, again, just filtration of the circle. It's more supporters than aggressives in my community. But generally, I do think there is a lot of expectation sometimes. And you almost have to say it out loud so that people can reset their expectations as well. And I have to say, like, the experience in different countries is very different. So when I am speaking about Black experiences in Ireland and someone speaking about Black experiences in America, which often happens in my company, right? Being an American company, you could have a Black History Month event that has 2 Black people on it. That is so important. And I'm always the person saying, we need a Black person who's not from America there, or we need a woman who's XYZ there, just so that you can show those differences quite blatantly to people so that the next room that they are in, they do not make an assumption that one person can speak for them.
I like that. I like that constantly. You must be exhausted and constantly thinking of all of well, no, that's making the assumption that it's hard, but it comes naturally, I think, when you see the world that way, which is how we all should see it. But from a reconditioning perspective, I know I was never destined to think that way. I was a very traditional Irish family, very white, very unexposed to anything remotely different, working class, and religious parents. I couldn't have ticked more stereotypical boxes of an Irish family. So the expectation would be that you'd get older, you'd get married, you'd have kids. You probably would still work because these days you could work, but you'd work in a nice job like in a reception or, I don't know, something that was second class again, I guess, and have a man who earns good money. So for me, it was relearning that whilst that all might be well and good for somebody who wants it.
Right.
I sure as hell didn't. And learning that was okay. And that's where it begins, I think. And you kind of step out your little box of expectations that have been preset for you, and you go, oh, nobody noticed, French. And then you step out a little bit further and you kind of go, it's kind of warm out here, and you just keep going and going. And that's where I keep referring to the 10 years. Like, so 10 years ago, if I was to look back and meet me from 10 years ago, I wouldn't say I wouldn't like me, but I'd be going, yeah, she's like, so not even closed mind, but so wasn't exposed to anything at all. And then once given the chance, like for me, something like COVID actually meant that I got exposure to people all over the world that I wouldn't have naturally gotten otherwise, because I now had time to mentor. And I began mentoring with mentors they're global, but the primary percentage of the mentees that they have are in Africa. And I remember being on a call with somebody who was, her internet kept dropping out, and she was studying a degree, I think, at the time. She was on the call with me. Her internet kept dropping out, but just the particular situation that she was in, the living environment that she was in was nothing like mine. And I don't live in a big old fancy house, but it was incomparable, and I couldn't have imagined that. She's worrying about her internet going, but her electricity was going. It wasn't just her internet. If my internet was dropping, it's because somebody downstairs is using a VR and they're just killing it on me, And I remember that being one of those pivotal moments where I was going, oh, it's really kind of different. And I'd been there, but I'd been there in a different capacity. You're there as a tourist, it's very, very different.
Yes.
So I think, I don't know what I'm even trying to say there. The more conversations with the more different people, like, it's just, I think I've only scraped the surface. There's so much more to learn and so much more to do. And it's really exciting. It's really quite interesting. And none of them scare me. It doesn't matter where somebody's from or what background they're supposed to have. At the end of the day, they bleed like the rest of us. They breathe like the rest of us. And they think. So I want to know how. How do they think?
I don't even know if it's a quote or like I made this up in my head, but I've said it so many times. I think it's a quote.
Now.
It's this idea that we are more alike than we are unalike as humans.
Yes.
And you just mentioned it being a pivotal moment for you mentoring this young person on the African continent. I remember I've similarly had a pivotal moment when I specifically moved to Abu Dhabi, and I was in this university where, like, we were I think there was like 140 of us in a graduating class.
Yeah.
And only maximum 3 people were from the same country. So I think there were like 54 countries represented in this graduating class. And I was the only person from Zimbabwe. And the nearest African country, like, in my graduation class was like Nigeria or Kenya or something, which is like really far from Zimbabwe. And in that moment, I realized, okay, no one has my experience. I don't have theirs. No one thinks like me. I don't think like them. And in that moment, I realized this matters. And we do need spaces to make each other aware of this. And it is sensitive because it is how we've all grown up for so long. So how do we navigate those sensitivities and things that people care about? And how do we care about each other in the classroom and outside? So for me, DEIB started like in school, but ultimately from a pivotal moment just like that, where I realized that everything that I had known and been taught is so different for the next person. And yet coming back to that, we are more alike than we are unalike. Like, my 2 roommates and still like closest friends were Korean. I could not tell you the number of Korean cultures, foods, expectations from parents, like, that are so similar to Zimbabwean
Really?
things, and yet similarly different things. So say, for example, like, my Korean roommate would always wear really tiny shorts, and I was like, you can't do that. But I would always wear strapless tops, and she was like, you can't do that. The principle was the same. It was around modesty of dressing that we had been taught. But for me, that applied to the legs, and for her, that applied to the shoulders. And it was like, when you found that common ground, the mutual respect was just beautifully there. But before the fact, I was just like, you need to put some pants on. She was like, wear a sweater. But it was, just some of these really tiny things that you don't realize actually like make or break how you think about other people, and how to like include them and integrate.
It's amazing because that's where you're biases will come in as well. Like I catch myself, I like sometimes to think, I talk to the boys, I have 4 boys, and I talk to them at the dinner table, and sometimes I'm like, I've got this so worked out, I finally figured this thing out, or I had a question about that, or I hit the nail on the head with something. But then other nights I find myself sitting down for dinner with them, and one time, I think it was about 6 months ago, I asked one of them, I was like, so what exactly is queer? Because here's what I thought it was, but apparently I'm wrong. And have them explain it to me. My kids are the best for, I say kids, like 3 of them are adults, one of them is 10. But they're the best for keeping me in line and teaching me some of the not even newer things, the things are there all along, but how it should be, because their level of acceptance for bullshit, frankly, and for ignorance is so much lower than any tolerance that I would have for it. And they're right.
Yeah.
I have a lot of conversations with people about you see in the newspaper articles now about the Gen Z, I think it is, that they're all getting fired because they won't work hard. And I was thinking about it, and like I've mentioned it a few times to people, and my niece taught me this, right? She's 15, nearly 16 now. And I'm like, it's not that they won't work hard, it's that they understand that your job isn't your identity, and they understand where it stops and it starts. So when they're finished work, they're finished work. And when they're about to start work, or when they start work, they start work. And it's very clear for them. And if you're taking the mick and you're not respecting them in the workplace, then they don't have time for you. They're not going to go above and beyond. They're all capable of going above and beyond, and will, if the place that they work in or the club that they're a part of aligns to their personal goals and interests. Whereas my generation, often separated the two. The job was what you did so that everybody thought you were big and great and wonderful, and you earned lots of money, and you made sure you had 2 cars, a big dog, and a fancy house, right? And then whatever you did outside of that, you did with what time was left over, which often meant that one parent at least wasn't around with the kids, or the environment wasn't ideal. And prior to that, then women weren't working. But I look at them now, and they teach me, like, sometimes they'll hear me talking about something or planning something or organizing something, and they'll remind me, they're like, Mum, it's like, I was there for one night, it's like, it's 1 a.m. Why are you still looking at it at 1 a.m.? It's still going to be there in the morning. Like, go to bed. You don't need to be doing that. Or, they'll sit down and they'll work it out with me, what needs to be done, and help me figure it out, or remind me, is this leading towards the goal you have? Because if it's not, then why are you doing it? And they're just, to me, they're better leaders than some of the leaders that are experienced and are thinking they're teaching us stuff. So I always, anytime I see those articles about the Gen Zs, I'm sure there's lazy people in every generation. Gen Z is not exclusive to that. Gen Z have a more, we gave them an absolutely shitty sandwich, and then we expect them to eat it and smile. Like, and if they're turning around and going, hang on now, this is not good enough, but this I can control, and I'm going to control it. That's just
It's interesting because when we even think about that, like as we talk about like diversity, inclusion, one of the things that like we're seeing in a lot of companies as well is initially diversity and inclusion focused on like gender, race, very, very basic, limited. And now we've expanded to that, covering things like caregiving and covering things like age representation in the work. People are working for longer, right? And then they're in industries like tech, which just started. And so what does it look like to include someone who's 50 something in how a company like operates? And I think people are forgetting that and not giving Gen Z the same amount of grace as we're giving the older generation. And I wonder if someone needs to look at, are we sort of like squeezing them out because they don't think the way we do?
yes,
When it comes to
absolutely.
Gen Z, like I always say to people, like, are you open enough to hire someone that you don't like, who can do the job, but you don't like them? Because that's what sometimes it tends to be when it comes to diversity. You don't like people because they're different from you, or they make you uncomfortable, you don't understand them. That's not a good enough reason to not include them.
Yeah.
And so, and whenever I see these articles, I'm like, okay, the lazy ones, what are you putting in place to make them less lazy before you just fire them off? But ultimately, fine. If someone's lazy and they're not actually doing any work, then they give someone who will do the work, the job. But if it is just that they approaching things differently and, not being as yes ma'am, yes sir as you're used to, then, check yourself and your biases and bring in all those diversity and inclusion principles to
Yeah.
really include Gen Z as well.
And there's so many biases. That's just one that always seems to be at the forefront of my mind. I genuinely think if we look at the economy and all of the workplaces in 10, I was going to say 20 years, definitely 10. 20 years feels like it's even way too long. I think you're going to see like this soar of businesses who figure out Gen Zs as if they need figuring out. Even as a parent, sometimes I don't think it's a Gen Z thing. It's just a parent and child thing. You think you've got them and then they change. And you're like, what? But yeah, learn to adapt all the time. But once we've got an environment that embraces everybody, those businesses are going to absolutely go. And then all the businesses who haven't are going to wonder why they're still where they were at 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because they're not appealing to the entire purchasing power that's out there. They're not being received, whether it's through marketing and whatnot, to everybody bar that closed group that they're focusing on, that they don't even realize that they're focusing on, if you know what I mean. And they're not embracing new ideas and new ways of thinking things. There's only so many new ideas and this is a generational thing, that people of certain generations can have because they haven't lived a world that younger gen, like even if you think about it, I don't even know if it is Gen Z. I think it is Gen Z. It's that like they had 2 years that we hated, and 2 years? It was 3 years. Sorry, that we hated, and we found really, really difficult. But we've been through our teens and we've been through our childhood, done the growth period, and they 2 to 3 years stolen in that really, really important period at which you learn how to navigate yourself and your friends and your life. And then we wonder why they're doing it differently. They've adapted to the world around them, needs must as such. So technically they're more adaptive than we are.
Then we are.
And it's an argument I could have, not an argument, sorry, it's a discussion I could have for years and years. I just think they're fascinating. And don't get me wrong, I can spot somebody who's idle from a million miles away, but I absolutely hate to see articles calling them that when I see how hard they work at things that everybody else thinks are not important, to be understood, to include everybody else, to see everybody equally, to make sure everybody gets the same rights as everybody else, to make sure that the things they buy are things that are protecting the world for their future. All those things that are so valuable and so important that we've ignored.
Yeah.
So they're not lazy, not a bit. Anyway, we'll come back to some work stuff. So you're a woman that leads these strategic operations in tech. And what would you say then has been the most pivotal in your journey? And if there was somebody else that wanted to come into the leadership roles, what kind of advice would you give?
Yeah. So I do strategic operations. And I think the key part of that is connecting the dots. A lot of operators will always talk to you about people, process, technology. But really what that means is looking up and seeing what processes over here connect to the ones over there so that we can streamline it better. Yeah. So, it's really about connecting the dots across those three elements and knowing that there's nothing you learn that is not worth learning. There's no one you meet that is not worth meeting. I think my most impactful work has really come from when I've been able to look up instead of be laser focused and make those connections. And it's interesting because when it's something that you actually do as a day job, you don't recognize it as a strength as much as someone who doesn't do that in their day job recognizes. So I have brilliant marketers and brilliant product people, brilliant communications people who are good at that. And so they look at me and they're like, how did you even think to connect those two things or to set up that process or to do that or do things that way? And I'm like, how do you do your marketing? But yeah, so ultimately that I think the pivotal thing was recognizing that what I do is connecting, whether it's dots or people, connection. And when I think about leadership, I think one thing that I'll say is that leadership means different things. So people need to define what that means for themselves. And, we've just been talking about like the ways we've been raised and the way we've always thought about it. And I'm like, I know when I grew up, leadership meant become the boss, right? So, and being boss meant, you are at the very top and like everybody reports into you. But now we live in a workplace where leadership might mean no one reports into you, but you are the one building a project from scratch, seeing it to completion and making sure you bring in all these other leaders. That is leadership too, right? Leadership might be being in a position of influence where you can make decisions, and then everyone else goes out to do the work. Or leadership can still mean being the boss and other people reporting into you. So I think as women, decide what kind of leader you want to be and what leadership means to you. And then make sure that you're working on things that actually help to build up your brand, your profile, and your experience to that leadership position. And don't let like the company's performance cycle determine when you are looking at your career and seeing if it's still going in the right direction. Do it more often without even formalizing it. Do it every time someone sends you a thank you, gracious. You're really good at that, right? Be like, hang on, what am I really good at? What did I do there? Is that actually on the path to what I want to do as a leader? What am I still missing that I need to make sure is on one of my projects next quarter or next year, so that I can continue to round out that full leadership experience? I think that would be, I hope I've answered your question there, but
Yeah,
be my well-rounded sort of.
I love that. I love that constant constant goal of improvement all the time. I think what I've seen with women as an individual doing annual reviews, say, in work, and as a hiring manager doing annual reviews in work, that women really suck at telling you what great things that they've done as a rule. So I know that prior to becoming a hiring manager, I remember coaching some of the other women in the company that worked with me. Now, some of them are in the office with me, and other ones are in different countries. And so what I had learned to do is I used to build out my calendar, and it would be all color coded. And from an ADHD perspective, I have to have something for like every minute of the day, because if there's a gap, I'm just going to sit there and wait till the next thing to do. So I might as well fill it with something. But I also color coordinated, and I made sure that anything that I was doing that could be work related, but isn't for work, that I had in a specific color. So I would achieve the work goals that were set, but I also then at the end of the year used to go back and pull out all the things that were that specific color. And I'd have this long list of achievements of things, whether it was that I spoke at an event, or I don't know, organized a group together, or drove a project or something like that, like you're saying. And I had details of that then from throughout the whole year. And then that went into my annual review. So there was absolutely no question that when it came around to looking for promotions or for increases and things like that, that I had built up all of the tools and skills that I needed outside of, like, I'd done it in work, but if I didn't have the opportunity in work to build that next set of skills, I found some way of doing it kind of outside of work, especially with leadership, because they won't necessarily, depending on where you work, they won't necessarily give you the opportunity to lead until you're a leader, which means you're stuck in that, I need the experience to get the job, but I can't get the job without the experience, that lovely loophole. So I went and drove projects outside of the company and got involved in groups and became leaders there. So I was able to come back and go, and mentored was a lot. I was able to come back and say, okay, I still want to go for this leader role. I am ready. And here's all the things that I've done, because there isn't anywhere else that I can do it within the company. So I'm showing you I've got the initiative to go and do it. But the keeping of the list, like, say if it's organic and it's happening in your diary anyway, you don't have to remember to keep it. But first time that I had to do an annual review on the women in my team, they had the list, because I'd mentioned it to him like a year or so before, kind of in passing. The guys did it anyway. They always had the list of stuff, but it was just really fascinating to see. And I was like, it was one of those moments where, like, I know they're going to get what they want now, because they know how to do it, how to build that argument.
And it's so important to get leaders who teach you to do that, right? Because so often women just say, oh, I was just helping. It's like, no, you put together an entire event, you spoke at it in front of 100 people, you coordinated, all of these. Yes, you were just helping, but you exhibited all of these skills that should 100% be made more visible. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I think more people should be, as you said, telling people to do that.
And we underestimate the skills. Like, if you sit down, I mean, if you work in sales and marketing, you're going to be good at listening to skills and telling people what they all mean. But if you sit down and think about, like, so I've often seen posts on LinkedIn where people are saying, give the job to the oldest sister, because the oldest sister knows how to, wrangle cats and get everybody together. Or ones about if it's a parent, or sometimes they've said if it's a mother, they know how to get 2 or 3 things done at one time and to do it on feck all sleep, And so I wouldn't be advertising that as being necessarily the way to go. there are skills you're learning and taking on board all the time if you're doing something other than work and home. Like I'm involved in the WISA side of things, and that's where I got the majority of the public speaking stuff came up through that, which led to podcasts and it leads to webinars, and it all adds more tools to the belt. So I didn't know about that in the beginning. I just did it because I liked it, similar to yourself. But it took me a while to realize that they were skills I could add to my skills list now that I picked up during my working life, but not necessarily through my work. And then they became ones that I did in work as well. So I'm all about loopholes and different ways of building out what you've got. I love helping people see that they've got skills they didn't know that they have. We're nearly up to time, and I feel like I'm only halfway through the questions because I wandered off and talked about things that were. I love listening to you speak passionately about what it is that you do, because I find that a lot of people that work in DEIB do, but you tie them all back to really, again, to human stories and simple, doable items as such. It's not all convoluted language and big difficult processes. Like, it doesn't need to be. I'm a big believer in that, and I love to hear you speak about it, because as you speak about it, it comes across simple and doable. And I'm sure there's people listening to it going, why are we not doing more of this? This is quite, this makes sense, and I'm excited about it. Got loads of energy. I have 101 different questions, but one that I would still like to ask, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to ask you for the last question today is for anyone that's beginning their career, so the other end of it, not necessarily going into leadership, whether they're going into the DIB side or going into the tech side, what would be the main piece of advice that you'd like to give them?
Sure. Okay, so I think the first is, so on the DEIB side, I think pick initiatives that are meaningful to you and that you're passionate about. We've talked a little bit about this, especially at the beginning when we're talking about, it gets tiring and it's exhausting and things like that. And that's real. So the burnout of driving DEI initiatives is real. And when all the processes and approvals and blockers, and we don't talk like that here, like get you down, many a time, the only reason that I've managed to finally get that thing out the door or finally drive that initiative was because I cared that much. So don't do things just because you're expected to or for show. Pick something you're passionate about. And honestly, we're all passionate about something when it comes to our identity. So just lean in there a little bit more to figure out what that is, and choose to drive initiatives in that space. And I think for anyone coming into DEI, tech, whatever it is, it's allow yourself to be multifaceted. I think, in a lot of these companies, you might come in a specific role, but there's always stuff to be done in a lot of spaces. And, you were just talking about this when you're like, well, when you couldn't lead over here, you decided to lead over there and bring it into this performance review. That's very true. So I think allow yourself to be multifaceted. And sometimes the best thing you can do is to make choices where you're dabbling in a lot of things at the same time, as long as they end up connecting. And going back to that idea of nothing you learn is irrelevant. Sometimes you might be put on a project that isn't your favorite. If it's your core job, find out the things that you can truly learn from that and that you can continue to apply in the next space. I think every job has stuff we hate. If I could say that, but every job has stuff that you hate, even the job that you love and you pray for, so to speak. To just do all the things, it will come together. It really does. I think, I don't know if you can relate, Jenny, but I look back to a lot of the things in my life and I'm like, oh, that this is, this totally does connect. And yet at the time I was like, why is this even the thing that I'm doing or focusing on? But it really does connect in the end. So keep pushing through and do your best through anything you touch. My favorite saying is never touch anything with half your heart.
Yeah.
So,
I like that.
Yeah. Do it intentionally and fully. And it'll all work.
Well, that's Sally. It's a really nice phrase to end on. And so true. I think, nobody wants to just work for the rest of their days anymore. You want to create something and be a part of something. And I don't think that's too much for anybody to ask, to be honest. Whatever it is that we do. So thank you so much for your inspiration and your passion. And it really is a pleasure to listen to you. And thanks for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jenny.